Today we're in for a treat. We have visiting from South Africa three presenters. Bram Fleisch from the University of Witwatersrand, and Korean Vorster from USAID in South Africa, and Karol Nugadiliwe, who's from the National Department of Basic Education in South Africa. And they're going to talk about some, what I would say is exciting new work about how education technology can play a role in helping to coach teachers and really change how we approach the quality of education. And so just so everybody who doesn't always come to this remembers, this is kind of a free-for-all kind of seminar. And so feel free to jump in along the way with questions, and we'll just let the speakers kind of manage the flow of discussion. And we'll pass it over to you guys. Thank you very much for being here.
So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Dave, for inviting us. Again, my name is Bram Fleisch, and I'm from the University of the Witwatersrand. Karol Nugadiliwe is from the Department of Basic Education. She's the Chief Director responsible for strategic planning, and Korean Vorster is the USAID representative in South Africa who is responsible for supporting the research that we're going to be talking about today. So a little bit about the project. The project is a project located in the Department of Basic Education. I am an academic who provides support and is a partner, but the work that we're going to describe, not just the study that I'm currently going to talk about, but the wider set of projects. The cumulative research program is located in and is being driven by the Department of Basic Education. USAID is the primary funder of this particular initiative, but we've also received extensive funding from UNICEF, from local funders, including Xenix Foundation, which is a local funder of education research, from our local big corporate sponsors like Anglo-American Chairman's Fund. So we've had extensive funding from a range of both international and local funders, but the work is essentially the work of the Department of Basic Education, and that's reflected in the fact that the logo is from the department. So a little bit of located in the context of the existing research. There's increasing evidence internationally that structured pedagogical programs, that's a phrase that comes from 3IE, programs that combine different elements are a powerful way in which we can begin to address early grade reading and education change in general. So moving away from the problem of access to the problem of learning, using methodologies that combine different elements. Is increasing evidence, not just in individual studies, but in reviews of research that suggests that putting together different components that are aligned can make a huge difference. And specifically, the work in Kenya, the work that's being done by RTI and has been over the last 7 or 8 years, and the work that we've been doing in South Africa largely confirms the notion of structured pedagogical programs that target specific pedagogical elements combined together can have a big impact. I use in the recent book, I'm going to give a small plug for my recent book, I use a notion of the education triple cocktail. Sorry about that. It's obviously a uniquely South African phenomenon, and it responds to the history of HIV/AIDS and the success of a triple drug cocktail that was significant in shifting the whole nature of the HIV/AIDS crisis in Southern Africa. So the combined cocktail, the structured pedagogical components are a key idea in moving forward the debate. In addition to that, there's a growing recognition that one of the key components of the structured pedagogical program is instructional coaching, one-on-one coaching provided to teachers on site. So we recognize that there's this combined program, but we recognize also that one specific approach to professional development, which is coaching, is an important component of it. And there's increasing evidence, not just in the global north, but even in the global south, particularly from Kenya, that suggests that it's going to work. And we've, in our last major study, also showed that, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. So the next graphic is just looking at the kind of combined components of lesson plans, good quality materials, and training and coaching are the key components to shift instructional practice in schools. Now, the first major study on which we're building, the current one that I'm going to talk about, was an early grade reading study that was developed and led by a colleague in the department, Dr. Stephen Taylor, who has really been at the forefront of using randomized controlled trials to test change models. In the major study called the Early Grade Reading Study 1, we essentially tried to test two major structured pedagogical programs, one with conventional training and the second one with coaching. We also tested a widely used intervention, a parent intervention. And we obviously had control schools, and it was a large-scale study that was representative of the bottom 60% in terms of poverty of the schools in South Africa. Just some information of the relative costs in US dollar terms of the three different interventions. So we did the study. It started out in 2015. We had our first intervention year, 2015, 2016, and then 2017. And the results suggested that the coaching intervention, which we're calling intervention 2, in looking at the specific outcomes of different learning, different components of literacy, letter recognition, word recognition, non-word recognition, paragraph reading, comprehension, phonological awareness, writing, maths, and English, across the board, save for the phonological awareness, the intervention that involved coaching was significantly more effective than any others. And even though it was more expensive, it was more cost effective.
What is exactly coaching here, actually, and what is the difference between coaching and training?
Okay, so the key component difference between intervention 1 and intervention 2 in the first study was that in the intervention 2, the coaching, there was a professional that visited teachers' classrooms once every 3 weeks. And in that event, in the coaching event, they would either model the new practice, they would provide structured critical guidance to the teachers, they would engage in conversations about the new practice, they would have conversations about the methodologies associated with it. So what was fundamentally different between intervention 1 and intervention 2, intervention 1, the teachers came to a central venue, they received training for 2 days per term. Intervention 2, we actually had somebody who went to the school, a professional, a qualified early grade teacher who understood not only how to teach early grade reading, but also had some insights into the coaching process that worked with teachers one-on-one in their schools, in their local context. If that helps.
I just want to throw out something for the non-education people here, which is that by far the most standard kind of intervention is this kind of training intervention where teachers get together at most for like a couple days or a day every term or something. So anyway, that's just the most kind of standard model globally.
How long was the coaching intervention, and what's the timing between the intervention and the measurement of the outcomes?
So, thank you. So the intervention took place over 3 years, 1 grade at a time, and we measured a baseline at the beginning before the intervention began in January. Our school year begins in January, ends in December. So the baseline was done in January, and then we successively measured children at the end of each year. So there's a learner testing at the end of December 2015, 2016. We didn't do it 2017. We're currently doing it as a delayed measure in 2018. It's about to be completed. So,
just to add, the reason why we're looking at these first 3 years is that we call it the foundation phase, is grade 1, 2, and 3. And ideally, a child should be able to read fluently enough to read with comprehension, at least by the end of grade 3, because in grade 4, all the content subjects come into the curriculum, and that's when they should be able to obviously use reading so that they can learn. And we're seeing that about 80% of South African children can't read with comprehension by the time they're 10 years old. And that's why the intervention is focusing on the student. So you'll see that we only worked with a teacher for 1 year. So we didn't stick with a teacher and give multiple years of coaching and instruction. We followed the learners. So every year the teacher was encountering this intervention for the first time.
The results of this study were obviously very powerful and have very powerful lessons for the department. We recognized that there was a modality of intervention, a change model that would work to substantially improve key reading tasks, skills that learners had in order to anticipate learning that they would continue throughout their schooling careers. But there was a big problem, and there was a lot of pushback. So even though we presented in a whole series of forums, it was presented to the provincial ministers of education, a lot of the administrators, senior administrators in South Africa said, oh, well, of course, coaching would work, but it's too expensive. And the question was, is it possible for existing district officials, people at the local level, to take on the responsibility for coaching? Because in the original model, we had outside service providers conducting the coaching. And we recognized that the existing, what we call subject advisors, would certainly struggle to provide the coaching, both because there aren't sufficient numbers of them and that they don't reach the schools very frequently. So this table over here is a list of all the provinces, and you can see the light red in, for example, LP is Limpopo, one of our poorest provinces. The vast majority of teachers in Limpopo, foundation-based teachers, never see a district official at all in the course of a single year. So there were constraints in terms of the number of officials available in schools. And more importantly, there was very limited amounts of money in the existing budgets to be able to provide transport to get to schools. But there's another added dimension to the problem of using existing government officials, and that even the ones that are responsible for the early grades, many of them have additional functions that go beyond the early grades. So, for example, for the first 6 months, or not so much 6 months, but at least the first 3 months of the year, many of those officials are responsible for making sure that all children are placed in schools. In the last 3 months of the year, we have a very high stakes exams which are monitored. So there was a recognition that existing officials couldn't necessarily do the job. Another suggestion was that we could get heads of departments within schools to do the job of coaching. But again, we recognized there were real constraints about that. So there were constraints because heads of departments and often in schools were doing a full teaching load themselves or didn't have the necessary expertise themselves. So we recognized that there were serious constraints within the system. Coaching was powerful, but the possibility of using existing officials was limited. But the problem that many people raised is getting outside service providers to provide coaches was obviously going to be a limitation. So we asked you.
I am just curious, in that first round, these outside service providers, what was their profile?
So the service provider that was responsible had done, was part of an intervention, coaching intervention that took place earlier. So the first effort to do the education triple cocktail, the structured program, was done in the urban province of Gauteng. And there were a whole series of service providers, these are private non-profit service providers, were hired to supervise coaches. And at the height of the Gauteng, the central province intervention, there were 500 coaches being used across the system. The problem was when the MEC's turn, when she was changed and there was a new provincial minister, the priorities shifted and the early grade priority essentially disappeared. And with it, all the coaching essentially became, was discontinued. So just to pick up the narrative, the big story that policymakers were interested in is there a way? We can all acknowledge that coaching is a powerful way to begin to shift teachers' practice to improve early grade reading. Are there alternatives? Are there ways of doing early grade coaching that could be cost effective and that could be used? And could we facilitate that process using technology? So the early grade reading study 2, the second one, essentially was animated by the question are there alternatives to in-school on-site coaching? That's the big question that we were asking. And could e-coaching, coaching using other technologies, particularly WhatsApp and tablets, could they be as effective as the conventional on-site coaching? And of course, this is the big question that everybody's asking. It's not just, is it effective, but can we provide a powerful narrative explanation for why it works? So increasingly, it's not just enough that we have powerful RCT evidence of impact, but can we provide an account of the mechanism by which it works? So I'm going to be talking about that to some extent. The design feature of the study was best be described as a mixed method impact evaluation. That's the phrase I like. I don't know anybody else has used it, but we recognize that we anchor all of our work around RCTs, but we have to answer questions about intermediate outcomes. We're interested also in understanding what the mechanisms are. We also want to do some theoretical work. So the RCT becomes the frame within which a whole range of different research studies take place to answer a set of questions that are critical policy questions from South Africa perspective. So in the new study, in the second EGRS, the early grade reading study, we had 80 control schools, business as usual schools, 50 which we called treatment one schools that were using our conventional structured pedagogical program with lesson plans, good quality materials, and coaching. And the second one where we tried our new technology-based solution. So that's the basic structure of the study that I'm going to describe now. It took place in one of the provinces in the eastern part of South Africa called Mpumalanga, and we focused on 2 districts with very, very careful selection of the study sites. We recognized that we couldn't just select all schools for one treatment in one district and another set of schools in another, because, for example, in South Africa, it's not uncommon to have a teacher strike localized in one particular district. So we have very, very systematically selected schools, so they were balanced between different districts, different languages, and more or less the same demographic profile of the schools. So we did that stratified random sampling to ensure that we had proper balance, which we achieved in the pre-test. Just in terms of the rollout, we started working with grade 1 teachers in treatment 1 and treatment 2 in 2017. In grade 2, we worked with grade 2 teachers in this current year, and we'll be working with grade 3 teachers and obviously their learners in 2019. In terms of learner testing, which is obviously the anchor around which we're going to be presenting today, we did a baseline test using an modified EGRA instrument in January 2017. I'm going to be presenting results from the study that we did in November 2017. And as of tomorrow, Friday, yes, we'll be finishing the results for 2018. So we're sitting on the edge of our chairs to know what the results will be. But we'll also be doing some further work after that. Come back next week. Okay. So let me just talk a little bit more detail about exactly what the interventionist consists of. And the point that I want to make is that none of this is particularly unique to South Africa. This is increasingly what we know really works. So I don't think there's any rocket science happening in South Africa. We are lucky to have a department that is committed to RCTs, but the basic components are now, everybody knows that these are what's required. So the basic components of interventional treatment 1, which is the standard one, is a set of lesson plans, daily lesson plans that teachers receive that provide guidance to teachers on their practice on a day-to-day basis. These are not heavily scripted, so they don't require teachers to follow line by line, but they do provide very clear guidance in the 3 or 4 activities that teachers need to complete in every day. And I'll come back to the lesson plans towards the end of the presentation. The second part of the intervention one or treatment one is a set of materials that teachers and learners have that included the big books, posters for vocabulary development, flashcards, and writing frames. Very simple materials that most schools should have and we know work as part of the process. In addition to that, in terms of the professional development, we have a coach who is a foundation phase, an early grade reading specialist who would visit a teacher once every 3 weeks, and that was a key part of the professional development. But we recognize that you can't just have coaching. There has to be some face-to-face training. So in intervention or treatment one, they also receive 2 days of upfront training, and then once a quarter, they receive an additional day of training at the beginning of each term, anticipating the lessons that would be taught for that term. The second intervention, which we obviously were particularly interested to find out more about, was the e-coaching. We called the e-coaching or the virtual coaching. And instead of the paper-based lesson plans, we provided teachers with lesson plans on a very basic $100 tablet, very basic entry-level 8 gigabyte tablet that was available, Chinese tablet that was available widely throughout South Africa. We basically produced a very elementary set of an app which provided teachers with insights in how to move through the lessons progressively throughout the year. They got exactly the same set of materials for the teaching and learning process. The big difference, though, wasn't just the tablet, but it was also what we call the e-coaching, which was essentially we identified and hired a coach who provided support using mobile technology and the WhatsApp app. So those are two pieces of the e-coaching process. Oftentimes the centralized virtual coach would make a telephone call once every 2 weeks to all of the teachers involved, and then would send a text message about the lessons that are about to be taught, and created a virtual environment or a community of practice with teachers within this, and I can talk more details about what that was and how it worked. In addition, there was extensive exchange of videos, not only the coach sending videos to the teachers, but the teachers also loading videos on the WhatsApp group. So it was a dialectic process around that. And again, there was training. In this instance, it was 3 days of training. Why there was a little extra training is because we needed to provide the teachers with an orientation to the technology, but more or less the same amount of training, direct training. Okay. So those are the two treatments. Here's an image. This was not in the. This was in the pilot. We did a small pilot to kind of find out how well the app worked, and you can see what the tablet looks like and what a training venue would look like in the South African context. Yes.
And so, in terms of the lesson plans that were either in paper or on the tablet, it seems like, I don't know, that kind of looks like a lesson plan. Yes. So basically the tablet lesson plan was, there was no fancy like interactive. It was just like having a PDF essentially.
Yeah, it was a equivalent and was originally designed on a PowerPoint format, and it was and scrolled through that format. There were a couple of features that were fairly unique. So, for example, when the teacher opened it, it went immediately to the day that the teacher was supposed to be on. But it didn't preclude the teacher from going backwards or forwards. But it did signal to the teacher, which is a very powerful part of the mechanism, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It did signal to the teacher the pace at which you needed to be going in order to complete the curriculum. So the intervention, what's really important is this is not a literacy innovation. This is essentially a change innovation. Okay, we did everything that was explicitly in terms of the standard curriculum. So it was based on a principle of additive bilingualism. The particular intervention was in English first additional language, or we call it first additional language or second language, that children were expected to learn listening and speaking in English in grade 1 and start introduced reading in grade 2 and grade 3. So that was strictly in terms of the policy. The number of hours that was to be used was in terms of the policy. The core curriculum in grade 1 was listening and speaking, so the children did not learn to read in English in grade 1. They were focused particularly on oral language development in grade 1. And we used all of the standard techniques that are specified in the national curriculum. So this is not a curriculum innovation. This was using the standard curriculum that we have and using different modes of delivery to try and establish whether we could improve the practice using the standard curriculum.
Ram, can I quickly add? So if you think back to that slide where you saw all the different resources, the big books and the posters and the alphabet charts and so on. So this is, as Bram is explaining now, this is the curriculum that's being implemented. And what it helps or what it gives teachers that they don't necessarily have in the business as usual is specific methodologies to use to teach specific learning outcomes. And also a certain routine. So on a Monday, you always do this. On a Tuesday, you always do this. And you have a weekly routine that you follow to make sure that all these skills are addressed. So in many other classrooms, they would have these resources. They would have big books and they would have an alphabet freeze. But what the lesson plan does is it integrates the resource for the teacher. So it will say, in order to do this, read this story today, use this big book. And then when you do the writing activity, it will, not in grade 1, later on, it will relate back to the specific resource. So just to explain that those books, it is what the government provides. But because this is an experiment, of course, we wanted to make sure that everything is there and that this specific book is integrated with the lesson plan that the teacher has. There's a range of options for teachers to use normally. So we had to integrate a specific text.
So, okay, now the preliminary findings, and if you're interested, we have published them. They're available in the International Journal of Education Development. They are available. We've received a very nice complimentary plug for Dave on the website, so thank you for that. So what are I'm going to just give you some of the descriptive statistics. Most of them are pretty much standard. We have the average age of the grade 1s around 6, which is pretty much standard internationally. We have more or less the same proportion of boys and girls, slightly higher proportion of boys. We have 2 languages, but that was conscious and deliberate. I'll talk a little bit about that because when we started doing the case studies, it turned out to be a little bit more complicated than the formal responses suggested. But we had 2 different language groups. We had isiZulu speakers and we had Siswati speakers, and that was Siswati is the main language of Mpumalanga, so that's why it would come out that way. What is particularly unique about South Africa is the age of our teachers, and particularly significant given the technology intervention. So the average age of the teachers in our study was 50 years old. So we have a very mature cohort of teachers. About 25% of them are over the age of 55. So this is a very significant factor in this intervention. Again, something quite unique to South Africa. There are very few male teachers teaching in the early grades, and you can then see the age, more detailed age. Characteristics of the school. We divide all of our schools by quintile, and quintile 1, 2, and 3 are the poorest quintiles in the school system. So you can see this is overwhelmingly the poorest schools of South Africa. So that's a really important part of it. And they're also, you can see from this particular, the donut, that we're also talking about schools that are what are called remote rural. So these are significant distance from the nearest urban center. So we're talking about schools that are more or less representative of the poorer 60% of South Africa.
If you say poorest schools, are these in terms of neighborhoods or the families that the kids are coming from?
So, Carol, you want to talk about the quintile system?
So, yeah, it's about the learners that are served by the school, but of course, in terms of the way that quintiles have been constituted over the years, the information we have is about the community around the school, and not so much necessarily the community within the school. But there is a work that's being done on creating a national set of quintiles, and that's why we can say that 60% of those schools, those the poorest schools are in those 3 quintiles. Depending on which province you're in, and in this particular province, it's not one of the most sort of well-resourced provinces.
Sorry. Voice. A little bit of information about the parents who served by these. 19% of them are young moms, younger than 25. The majority of them, of the moms, haven't completed secondary schooling, so that also gives you a kind of a flavor of the profile of the learners served by it. And only 6% of them have a post-school qualification. So the main finding we're going to be talking about is the learner assessment at year 1. And we had a test that was designed to provide us with information that would be useful not just in this round but in subsequent rounds. So we had a whole range of different tasks. We tested kids in their home language. We tested English phonemic awareness, letter recognition, word recognition, English listening and listening comprehension, which were going to be the very key ones because tasks 6, 7, and 8 really maps directly onto the curriculum. But we also wanted to see what they were like in terms of reading in grade 1 so we could be able to look at gains for grade 2. But in terms of the curriculum, it's tasks 6, 7, and 8 that are the main tasks required by the curriculum. And here are the results. So at year 1, we have our control schools, business as usual. We have on-site coaching or treatment 1, and we've got virtual coaching, which is the tablet. And you can see on key tasks. So for example, children are asked, close your eyes in English. You can see that there's a big difference between the control and the treatment, but no significant difference between the on-site coaching and the virtual coaching. There was a second one was stand-up. Again, slightly different pattern, but there's definitely difference between the control and the 2 interventions. More complex tasks that require 2 different commands or 2 different activities. Put your hands in the air. The children were less able to do that. And turn around, it didn't seem to make that much difference whether they're in a control or a treatment school. But when we looked at children's identification of simple vocabulary, you can see that there was huge gains for children who were in one or the other of the treatment. So for children recognizing the word cow or pig, there was a huge difference between kids who were in the control schools and the children in the treatment, with surprising evidence that children in the virtual coaching schools were doing better on vocabulary than the children in the on-site coaching. On the more sophisticated vocabulary listening comprehension, we hadn't really made much headway. And that's not really surprising. These children are learning English vocabulary for the first time. Very few of them are living in an environment where English is available. So the children, we can sort of suggest that the children are learning very basic vocabulary but haven't yet become fluent in English by the end of grade 1. So that's a really important insight that we have here. In terms of the Z scores or the measures of impact in terms of standard deviations, this is the really big thing that I think that the Journal of Education Development was particularly interested in is in the listening component, we can see very substantial, I guess these are moderate or middle level findings about the impact. So 0.37 for on-site coaching relative to the control. For virtual, it's slightly lower. But for vocabulary, again, we see that the virtual is slightly higher than the on-site. So we can see more or less it didn't much matter on 2 key areas, listening and vocabulary, that the 2 different interventions seem to be doing more or less the same in terms of the performance. And that was a big surprise for us. I wanted an aside. So we were worried about one problem, which I'll highlighted in the data, which is the potential for a crowding out effect. So in the original EGRS, we found that children's scores in English, even though the intervention was in home language, was improved in the intervention schools. In our EGRS 2, the new one, which is an English intervention, the home language tended to be, or at least some evidence that it was weaker in intervention, which seems to suggest that the teachers were focusing more on teaching English than they were teaching in the home language. So we're going to be looking at that much more closely. But when we started to do the interviews, we got another story, which was an interesting story to be told as well. So what were the relative costs of the two different interventions?
Sorry, maybe before you go to the costs, you didn't collect data on the teachers. I mean, how they learn, actually their learning outcomes themselves.
Yes, we did, and I'm going to. So we collected data on obviously the baseline, on learners at year 1, but we also collected data on the intermediate variables, which is teachers' practice. And I'm going to present some of the data as well.
Okay.
So just a little bit about costing, and obviously costing is kind of complicated at this stage in the study, but the virtual coaching is not substantially less expensive. So that was an important insight. There's partly because there's the cost of the tablet, and partly also because we included significant training as well. So those are key cost drivers. But there were obvious advantages to the virtual coaching in terms of reach. So even though there's a slight advantage in terms of cost, there are other advantages that we could think about from a policy perspective.
Good question. So were you also expecting to take outcome outside of the virtual?
So we didn't have a formal. We did. My gut instinct was that the virtual coaching wasn't going to work. To be absolutely frank with you, I was deeply skeptical. I didn't think that. We thought that we needed, because there's lots of pressure to think about technology in the policy space. We thought we needed to do this, but there was very little evidence of success using technology to improve learning outcomes at this level in South Africa.
So it wasn't about just about cost.
Well, there was. We were interested in cost. We thought it would be substantially less expensive. Turns out it wasn't substantially less expensive. And obviously we need to think about that again, because there are different permutations that we could look at. And I think that there is a possibility of reducing the cost of the virtual coaching over time. But as it stands at the moment, when we did the cost analysis, there wasn't a huge cost savings.
I think that just without anticipating the rest of the conversation, some of the expectation, I'm also a bit of a sort of Luddite. And I really do believe that a lot of the costs related to the virtual coaching are about the package, about how the fidelity of that which sits behind the virtual coach, including how the materials and the support happens, etc. So around the lessons. So I think that's very, very important. That takes effort, and it takes a lot of personnel, I guess, input. And so one shouldn't underestimate that, where it's effective. And I think then we're just talking about marginal cost savings that are brought about by using this technology. And I think that it's a very important thing to think about going forward.
If I could just add, a place where we really are seeing economies of scale is that one on-site coach can work with about 15 teachers at a time. One virtual coach can work with 90 teachers at a time, 90. And you asked earlier, Dave, what is the profile and the skills of the coach? And so that's an area where, at a system level, we don't know where we're going to find coaches that has that level of skill and the right personality and that is willing to work in these deep rural areas in the right languages. So if we can save on that end, that's where it really is important. Not so much the dollar value, but where the human resources come into play.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
On the cost side, for the on-site coaching, given that they're so remote, I'm wondering if there's a driving of the cost as the transportation and the associated cost to that, and just get a confirmation on that. And then more on this issues of how we think about the two interventions. I don't know if this is the right moment to discuss this, but as you were mentioning, it's not, we shouldn't think of this as the same intervention but provided virtually. There are elements about it that in terms of how it is delivered that make it somewhat different. And I'm wondering if we can unpack that a bit, this issue of the way that an on-site coach can actually see what's going on in a way that probably the virtual coach can't, and how on the virtual side coach there is a more personal, but potentially even more intimate relationship that is more one-to-one as opposed to a group-to-one. So I don't know if we can talk about that.
So you're anticipating when the discussion of the mechanism. So I think you're spot on. There are issues there that are really useful to think about, and I think we'll talk about those. So let me go on a little bit, talk about, I won't dwell on the slide, but this is not the solution to all South Africa's education problems. So don't want to mislead you. There's no magic solution. A substantial portion of kids are still not on the map. And there's clearly very significant progress, but it's not going to make every child a reader at the end of grade 1. So that's just a caveat to make it clear to everybody. This is not a magic solution. You asked about we measured what was going on in the classrooms, and there were also very powerful insights about what was going on. So the first slide looks at a very simple indicator. Were the teachers following a lesson plan? So every teacher in South Africa is expected to have a lesson plan, whether it's their own lesson plan or a provincial lesson plan or a lesson plan that's provided to us. And you can see in the control, loose or no match between the lesson, you can see a significant portion of the teachers in the control were not doing anything or even remotely resembled what they said they should be doing. But if you look at the treatment 2, which is the on-site, it's the virtual coaching, all of them, all the teachers were doing exactly what the lesson plan expected of them. So that's a huge shift that's taking place, that there's a lesson plan and the teachers are doing what they're expected to be doing in the lesson plan. So that was a really important insight from our observations in the classroom. But there were also really important shifts that were taking place around the use of English. Remember, this is grade 1 oral language development in English. You can see in the virtual coaching, which is the green, our observers who went into the classrooms saw that the teachers were, a quarter of the class were talking to teachers in English. There was a significant number more talking in English. Most English responses from learners, again, huge difference between the two interventions and the control. Mostly always given English instructions, again, very big difference. What's really significant, though, is this one here. There was no or minimal code switching. So for most classrooms, even though this was English instructions, most teachers would give the teaching lesson in the home language. Okay? So imagine you're teaching children to speak English, but the lesson is actually not taking place in English. And this is not unique to South Africa. This is a widespread problem. The teachers not understanding the centrality of using the new language to teach the language. So we can see that the teachers are beginning to shift using the two different interventions very clearly. And obviously English greeting, everybody does. Good morning, sir. Good morning, ma'am. That's ubiquitous too.
I am
okay.
fine.
So these were our case studies. Essentially more or less found the same basic insights, that the interventions predominantly use of English by teachers and learners, many opportunities for the learners to speak English individually, brand new stuff. In the control schools, in the business as usual, there was almost no opportunities to use English. Learners exposed to extended text, very important new development. More opportunities to write creatively and longer text exercises. Introduction of vocabulary. There was some, when we talked about writing, we talked about children drawing pictures, so just kind of the pre-writing process. More English print was visible in the classrooms. Time was very important, and I'll come back to time in a minute. Covering the content of the lesson mostly was taking place in the intervention schools, and there was a lot less wasted time, and I'm going to dwell on the question of time because that's a key component of understanding the mechanism. So what exactly are the mechanisms? So we've done a whole series of in-depth case studies, both in EGRS 1, the first set of studies, and in the second set of studies, and we're about to publish the first paper on the mechanisms in the EGRS, which focuses on the question of time and space. And my PhD student has just completed her fieldwork that focuses explicitly on the questions of emotions and change. And I'll talk very briefly at the end about what we're discovering about what's going on in the virtual WhatsApp groups, which is completely new, which we didn't expect to see. So you're going to hear it. This is the first time we're really presenting this. Okay. And I don't even have a slide, so I'm going to have to tell you. Okay. So the first really important insights is about the lesson plans and the mechanism. So one of the things that we've discovered and we've known about for a while is that teachers essentially don't have a sense of what it takes to teach for a full year. They don't know how many days a year that they need to teach. They don't know how to map the teaching time against the curriculum. So what the lesson plans do is it reconstructs teachers' macro time. They need to understand now that there are approximately 200 teaching days or equivalent, or it's actually less, it's 160 real days a year, and that they have to teach all of them. So many teachers would say, well, we can take leave because we don't really understand that taking leave means that we're sacrificing time. When they're confronted with the lesson plans that comprehensively plots the days against curriculum completion, they suddenly understand that each day is a precious day, and that with missing a day, you're missing out a key part of the learning process. So the lesson plans have a way of signaling to teachers the centrality of using time strategically across the year. So that's a very important part of it. But this is a kind of intermediate level of time. So we're able to say, not only across the year, but within the day, within the lesson, the teachers are using the time comprehensively in the way that's envisaged in the curriculum. But there's a second dimension of time that's really important, what I call micro time. And that teachers who are using the lesson plans have a much better understanding of the importance of managing micro time, transitions. So when traditionally a teacher would spend 2 or 3 or 4 minutes transitioning between activities, the signaling of the lesson plans about transitions and the support that they receive allows them to transition much more quickly through different activities across a day. So you're talking about time across a single year, but time within the space of a single lesson. And that has changed significantly, where teachers are able to move through different lessons much more rapidly and able to use time much more effectively in the context of a particular lesson.
On this micro and macro time, I'm curious whether you see, for example, and I don't know if you have data on this, but actual like lower levels of leave taking. I mean, it seems like that's something like quantitative that you could actually see whether in these treatment groups, whether teachers are just taking leave less because they have this better sense of the importance of each day.
We've never tracked that, but certainly it's an issue that's emerged in our interviews. So we have teachers that regularly say, I feel I can't take leave because we'll fall behind, or the children will miss out on a section of the curriculum. So there's a greater sensitivity about the centrality of time. And I mean, one of the big insights in South Africa is that working class kids in poorer schools, receive a substantial lower proportion of instructional time than middle class kids. So this addresses that fundamental issue that is a central part of the inequality story in South African instruction.
I just want to add about the micro time as well, that the fact that there's a routine that's part of this implementation plan gives momentum to the class, because the little kids in grade 1 very quickly know what happens on a Monday and what happens on a Tuesday and what happens next. So they anticipate it, and they're already moving in that direction. So in terms of managing the classroom for the teacher and saving those minutes on a daily basis, the routine is really contributing to that as well.
So the second insight around the mechanism is something that is emerging very strongly in the research we're doing on teachers and coaching. And there's a recognition that the coaching process has thrown up a whole set of emotional issues around change. So one of the things that we're finding in the interviews we're doing is that teachers come to our program with what is colloquially called a play, hide, and seek. Teachers essentially are not engaged. They're not switched on. They're emotionally avoiding authorities, avoiding any sense of responsibility for external programs. And that sitting behind this particular set of behaviors is a deep sense of fear and shame. I mean, these are two crucial emotions that teachers, when we start to interview them, the second and third round of interviews, and really get to know the teachers, they begin to talk about fear. Fear of being discovered that they're not doing what they're supposed to do. And shame because they recognize that they have a critical role to play in the children's lives. So there's all these complex emotions that teachers have around the change process. There's another really important, very, very fundamental emotion, which is the fear that is associated with trying something new. Many of our teachers have been working for 25, for 30 years, teaching early grade, and they're very fearful of trying something new. They're very reluctant to enter that space. So one of the things that we're beginning to recognize is that the coaching addresses all of these emotions of change. So there's a precondition for teacher learning, and the precondition for teacher learning is trust. And the teachers are coming with a very, very well-established barrier or mask to the change process. In order to get them to start the learning process, to learn the new practice, they have to establish some level of a new level of intimacy and trust for the teachers to begin to open themselves up to recognize their own inadequacy and to begin to learn the new practice. So we never saw this. We always, and much of the literature on coaching always recognize there's trust involved, but they don't recognize that the trust process is intrinsic for the learning process to take place. And we don't know if this is unique to South Africa or whether this is a phenomenon that is common in much of the global South. Certainly, it doesn't seem to be an issue in the global North. But certainly in South Africa, the trust deficit is a central feature of teachers' experiences in learning to change their practices. So teachers must feel supported to meet new expectations and the recognition to begin to engage in a systematic and substantial way with the new practice. So what we're calling emotional readiness is in some ways the very first stage in the change journey for teachers to learn the new practice. But that's just the beginning process. It's not the only thing. This is the teachers also, once they've begun the process of learning and feeling secure and feeling emotionally ready for change, they then are able to learn the new practice. And the key component of learning the new practice is learning a new technical vocabulary. Teachers had very little technical vocabulary to describe the professional work that they were doing. So, for example, they had in the curriculum key concepts like group-guided reading or phonics. When you probed, they had no sense at all what these concepts were about. They had no way of making use of a professional vocabulary. So it was getting that emotional support and then beginning to open yourself up to be able to learn a new professional language, but learning it in the context of practice. So it wasn't learning it in the abstract, but a teacher seeing a coach modeling shared reading or group-guided reading gave the teachers insight into what the technical vocabulary actually meant. So that was a key component of the change journey that we're talking about. And it was clear that it didn't matter whether it was treatment 1, the face-to-face, or it was treatment 2, which is the virtual coaching. The new technical vocabulary began to emerge during the course of the year and over the course of 2 years. But we need to recognize that it was fragile and it's not common across all teachers. And finally, the stage 3, we're also something we had never anticipated. Okay, and let me kind of move away from the slides. The one of the things that emerged very strongly was the teachers' request to be held accountable for their professional practice. So once the environment had been secured, the teachers were asking the coaches regularly, am I doing it right? Am I doing it right? And the professional accountability became a central feature of the new practice. And as teachers became more familiar with the practices, they became more proficient, more fluent in the new practice, they also began to shift the way in which they thought about their kids and they thought about their profession. So it was the new practice that was actually central in shifting the way they thought about change over time. So these are insights that are brand new for us. They're very fresh. They haven't been published. They're just coming out. We've seen them in earlier studies, but I think much more systematically in this current study.
So may I ask how the coach assesses the teacher's performance?
Okay, so what's really crucial is you've got a lesson plan. So the coach knows what the teacher is supposed to be doing on a daily basis. So, for example, on Wednesday, they have a routine, a weekly routine. Every Wednesday, the teacher is expected to do something called group-guided reading. We know what group-guided reading is. Group-guided reading is a crucial activity that allows the teacher to individually assess children's reading ability. So the coach can then... Well, it's more than just implemented. Have they understood and have they mastered the new technique? It's not a simple implementation question. Because if you're a teacher, and most of these teachers have never ever used group-guided reading, which means that you're dividing the class up. If you've got 40 children in a class, you divided them into 5 groups or 6 groups. You're seeing each group of 6 or 7 children. You're sitting on the floor and you're listening to them read. But it's not just listening to them read. You also have to recognize that some children need specific skills in, for example, word attack skills.
Yeah, I understand. My question is, how does the coach, do they observe, do they monitor?
Yes, no, they do. I mean, they're there once every 3 weeks.
I'm thinking about the virtual one. I'm sorry. So how does that happen virtually?
Okay, so I'm going to explain how that works. And this is one of the things that we didn't really fully understand until recently. So the virtual coach, the virtual coaching process happens first. The first intervention happens with a telephone call. So the coach, the virtual coach in Johannesburg calls up the teacher and says, this week, the next 2 weeks, we're concentrating on the phonics blend, the FR, frog, like frog and from and front, okay? And would say that the coach would say, how are you feeling about teaching the sound? And the teacher will say, totally on top of it, gonna do it, or, I'm really struggling with these sounds, I can't really understand. So the coach, the virtual coach, will then say, I've spoken to the teacher, she's indicated she's having difficulty, there's a follow-up phone call the next week, okay? But there's more, okay? So the virtual coach is then sending a WhatsApp message to the group saying, everybody remember we're doing the sound. I know the following people are having difficulty, well, not the following people, but some people are having difficulty with this. And here is, I'm going to send you a short 3-minute video clip, 30-second video clip on how to do the sound. And then there'll be many of those, essentially signaled by what the teachers are telling the virtual coach. But that's only a small part of it. Then every fortnight, there are what are called competitions. So there are 9 groups in the 91, or 10 groups in the 91 teachers. And every 2 weeks, the teachers enter a competition where they take the practice that they're supposed to be using and learning, and they videotape themselves and they send it onto the group. And the top winner of the week gets $5 in airtime as an incentive. But the process of both the signaling of the new activity, which is linked to the lesson plans, plus the criteria for the competition, plus the videos, are all providing teachers with lots of opportunities to master the new practice. And it also enables the teachers to benchmark their own practice against not some kind of best practice, but against practice of their teacher in the neighboring school. And they're having competitions and they're having conversations about the practice. So the WhatsApp group, which is obviously a crucial part, and the technical vocabulary that's being created, allows the teachers an opportunity to move into this more technical space around early grade teaching of reading.
So when the teachers are sent the materials, is there a mechanism for tracking whether or not they have opened the files, or do you know if they actually have opened those files when they're sent?
Yeah, I mean, there is a mechanism, because WhatsApp allows you to check whether teachers have actually opened the file or not. So I don't know if you know WhatsApp, but there is a 2 check marks, and you immediately know whether. So you know how to. So and it's ubiquitous. All of our teachers use WhatsApp on their. Everybody's got 40 different groups that are active all the time. So the technology is, no matter how old you are in South Africa, everybody uses WhatsApp all the time. So, and there's a mechanism, but we also have a back end to the lesson plans where we can track how frequently and when and teachers are actually looking at the lesson plans, but we don't use it currently for purposes of accountability because we have such a massive trust deficit that if we did, I think people wouldn't be being honest about it. So we do have that analytics and we have that capacity, but I haven't reported it and we're not likely to use it, not for the time being.
It does seem, it's interesting, like these competitions where people send in the videos, like there's a real peer accountability role that gets played. I mean, my initial thing with the virtual was, well, is it just encouragement essentially? But it seems like that provides this additional element where there's peer pressure to actually do your best and try to implement it, and someone's going to see it, even if there isn't hard accountability in terms of like getting fired or something, like the respect of your peers. And
I mean, look, we need to know a lot more about it. This is literally stuff we've been looking at in the last 2 weeks. So this is very, very fresh, but there's no doubt that it's going on, and it's not going on for all teachers. So it's not as though every teacher in the system is immediately hooked into the competition. We have got about 35% of the teachers seem to be entering the competition. As soon as the competition gets announced, there's a response and they're there and they want the $5 in airtime and they're entering it and they're very aggressive. Even though the coach who is adjudicating the competition says, I'm not going to allow the same teacher to win every week or every 2 weeks. It doesn't seem to make a difference. Even though the coach makes it clear that she's going to spread the prizes equally, there are a whole lot of teachers that are completely engaged in the competitive part of the teaching process. But we don't know. I mean, this is really, really early stages in the thinking around these processes.
Yeah, actually, that was my question, because I was wondering what is the proportion of teachers who participate in this competition. And my sense is also that this competition can have maybe another effect on other teachers. Actually, they won't participate because they will see the same who win every time, who participate. So it would be really interesting to see, actually.
So we are tracking that. I mean, we know because of WhatsApp, we can track systematically every single time that teachers either go online on the WhatsApp group or enter some evidence around their practice. So we have that kind of information. there's a conscious, deliberate effort not to have the same teacher win every week or every 2 weeks. So, but again, I've been tracking anecdotally tracking the process. There's no doubt that there are at least 3 groups. There are teachers that are extremely, and it's roughly a third of teachers that are very active, another third that enter but aren't necessarily particularly enthusiastic, and a third that are not entering at all.
Will you know the characteristic of?
No.
So,
not at this point.
I think what it does do is it helps the virtual coach to know who she needs to give extra attention to. It's a sifting process. And it's maybe also worth saying that Gina, who's our virtual coach, doesn't have a script for this. And a lot of it, she is finding ways to connect with her teachers and to get that monitoring information back. I just wanted to add to what Bram said earlier. So they met her at the training. They do see her face to face at those training days at the beginning of the term. And when I've been on school visits and Gina came along, there's a genuine connection and a relationship. So it's not like she's a real person for them. And then I also wanted to add on the tablet. So we tried to compromise for the fact that there's no person going to the school that can demonstrate how to do the big book or can sound out certain, phonics or whatever it is. So on the tablet, we've added sound clips that pronounce some of these English sounds, because the teachers are not English speakers themselves either. And there are also videos on the tablet that's already there to demonstrate certain of these methodologies that are slightly longer. So the ones that Gina makes, she literally films herself. This is how you hold the book, and this is how you page. And it's 30 seconds, and she sends it out. And then, of course, they also learn from each other as they are sharing these videos. That's what I wanted to add.
Can I? It's a question on study design, because obviously this is fascinating, but it begs the question of how sustained these changes are. And I was wondering if you can keep on measuring the kids, the first graders or teachers who have been exposed to the intervention, and not only sort of the longitudinal cohort of the kids who were followed throughout, in terms of checking whether the teachers even if they're exposed only for 1 year, keep on doing the same sustained practices or not, or whether through WhatsApp, if in the e-coaching they keep on interacting and sharing this peer-to-peer learning after intervention has ended.
So, I mean, the cost factor in doing a multiple year, multiple grade is very high. So what we're doing is essentially following a cohort of kids, not a cohort of teachers. So we would be very nice to see the extent to which the teachers are continuing the practice over time, not just the kids over time. So we don't know that, although we will sort of look at that issue, but it'll probably be in a qualitative case studies rather than have a systematic data set for that over time.
We did now collect data in that original study for the home language, the Setswana. We've just collected data to look at the grade 3s, which would have been the next year, the year that the teacher's not receiving the intervention. She got it last year, and now she's supposed to be using it. So we will look at those kids and see whether they, after grade 1, 2, and 3, whether they are also doing better than the control group. And then we're looking at the grade 4s who went through that whole thing with their teachers, kind of first time fresh, and to see how they're doing in grade 4.
Can I just, following up on Emanuela's point, it would be interesting. So, for example, with the virtual coach, and there's this WhatsApp group that's very active. So after that year where the teachers are receiving this coaching, is there any way to just see, are those WhatsApp groups still active? Where those groups of teachers, it seems like that's a simple indicator of just whether, people are still engaging in this. Obviously not obviously, but I imagine the virtual coach herself, she isn't participating in that group with that group of teachers anymore. But if the teachers themselves are sort of engaging in any peer feedback.
There are many questions we'd be very keen to find the answers to. So what can you want to add?
I think we like he said cause, but I actually think that there's an element of what we know, what the research tells us about how teachers' attitudes change in terms of their own agency in learning. And we feel that that's at the heart, if you like, of making this change in practice. So it's not just about a study, but also about trying to get practice adopted and replicated within the system. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but later on. But obviously, the longer we collect data on both the teachers and the learners, the better for all concerned. But it's also about sort of embedding and institutionalizing that practice and what it means for the system. And it's really, really important, the modeling that's happening through the WhatsApp conversations, the professional learning communities, which I used to think were sort of warm and fuzzy, but actually do make a difference, I think is really important.
So I'm on my last slide. So what we're suggesting is that locally designed, low-cost, integrated technology solutions may really work. We'll know in the next 2 weeks. I mean, maybe that's a bit optimistic. Maybe in the next 2 months. But I think we've got something that's really powerful that we weren't expecting, and that's exciting. It's very exciting. And it may be important complement for remote schools. It may be something we can use in specific ways, but there's definitely something new that we can add to our understanding of how teachers can improve their professional practice. Definitely we'll have results if any of you will be going to San Francisco in April. We'll be launching the formal year 2 results in April next year. And we're in the process, I see there's a mistake, of doing a whole series of new allied studies. So we're very keen to understand costs much better. At the moment, our cost analysis is very global. We need to know much more about how the costs work. We also, and I think this is a crucial part of what Carol's interested in, is to what extent we could embed this in existing government budgets. Because we're interested, if it's going to be sustained, it's not going to be sustained with external donor support. It has to be part of existing budgets, and we've got to find the ways in which different components, line items in government budgets could be mobilized. But it also requires a lot of work from the minister and from the presidency and from strategic planning to work with provinces to understand the centrality of aligning existing resources around a crucial issue like early grade reading. We also recognize that we need to know a lot more about moving from one coach to moving to 500 coaches. It's a completely different animal. So we need to understand a lot about recruitment, around training, and about management of coaches. We have some experience, but very little. So that's the next set of dimensions. And we're currently working at a kind of intermediate level, a meso level, around scaling up, and we're learning lessons around that. And then there are also a whole lot of other new things we need to do. Again, everybody in the early grade reading space knows about it. So even if we are very successful in getting our teachers to change their instructional practices, if children are not reading and don't have resources that are appropriate for them to read in the home, they're not going to consolidate their reading practices. So we're at the moment about to do a classroom library intervention, another RCT, which will deal with not just the teaching of reading, but the reading in the home environment. And that's it. Carol, you want
I'd love to hear, and perhaps Caro is the best place to say this. I'm excited about this analytical sort of work going forward. I'm curious about kind of the immediate sort of implications for government. You know, there have been these 2 really interesting studies coming forward, and there are a lot of questions, but whether they're kind of immediate implications or whether it's still kind of let's learn a little bit more kind of strategy.
So I think, there's some slides that Bram put up, which could actually sort of edit and replace emotions around change, for instance, within the public sector, within the policy-making environment. Those are things that are not very easy to change. Just getting the space to do this kind of work in the department requires a lot of sort of ducking and diving. And I think that's really, really important. So firstly, just changing the attitudes to information and evidence that can be quantified, that we know actually works, takes a lot of sort of backroom work. So that's the one thing. So I think originally, sort of when we got the first set of results, there's clearly 30 to 40% improvement in a year of learning, off a very low base, by the way. There was a lot of, okay, so we're going to scale up, 26,000 schools, and that's not how it works. So it's really, a lot of it is also about how you bring together the interests around line items. So the curriculum people, the people responsible for measuring learning, along with the people who are responsible for materials, to look at this as their results too within the policy space. And I think in developing country context, that's really, really important. We've at least secured some support for doing this in the Northwest Province, sort of expanding it. So that's sort of our version of scale. And we think that that's a really good sort of touch point for other provinces to then do some of the work that's related to that. And I think that's basically, it's also changing the attitudes to evidence and this kind of evidence for the first time in the system. The second thing, of course, is just also changing the way development partnerships work. So there's lots of NGOs in the different parts of the system that are doing teacher development, some of digital inputs, devices, etc., and also trying to bring those together to focus on actually what's happening in classroom. That's like herding cats, but we're slowly beginning to see that. So the big thing, particularly in terms of the work, the results, is getting the curriculum colleagues to understand this is about implementing the curriculum. That's our messaging. It's about implementing. It's not new. It's not a new program. It's helping people to implement the curriculum. And that's helped us to get some traction.
Any more questions?
Yeah, thank you. It was really, really interesting. So I'm really interested by your point about the fact that this teacher wasn't really used to the technology and they weren't really accepting the technology at the first time. And I'm really wondering how you explain that they use it. They were more likely after the coaching and everything to be able to master the technology. I think that would be interesting to know for other programs that want to implement this type of things.
So one of the things that seems to emerge in the interviews with teachers is that teachers put up what one of my colleagues call a mask. They put up a veneer, a barrier. So they enter any intervention with a very, very clear mask or barrier. And that's to protect themselves. Because they've been through many different interventions and they've been disappointed or they've been exposed before. So they are very reluctant to reveal their true selves or their inadequacies. So one of the things that is important about the change journey is that until such time as you're able to persuade them to drop their masks, they're not likely to take up the program except in a minimalist compliance way. So teachers always do what they're told to do, but they're not necessarily going to learn the new practice. So one of the things that is clear about the coaching, and in this instance, both the virtual coaching, because they do know the coach, and the face-to-face coaching, is it allows them to build trust so that they can begin to move towards engaging in a genuine learning of the new practice. That's what we suspect is a key to understanding the mechanism of change, which is, I think, quite new. I don't think people have fully understood how that process actually works and why it is that even strong programs often don't get taken up because they don't understand this kind of binding constraint, this emotional barrier that is established in the change journey.
Liz, who we haven't heard from, and then Alonso to the last question.
Thanks for the presentation. It's quite interesting that you have this older cadre of teachers, and how difficult was that to move them into a coaching type of environment? Because in similar early grade reading program in Uganda, especially when for younger kids, you find younger teachers, and then it's easier to map them to like a cluster coordinating tutor who's a little bit more senior. I found that to be quite challenging in Uganda. How did you deal with that? Or was that an issue at all, that the older teachers were not really willing to go under this coaching?
I mean, look, we haven't explicitly looked at that issue, but it didn't seem to be a major issue in our discussions with the coaches or with the teachers. I mean, there's a historical reason why we have such an old cohort of teachers, and that is that under apartheid, African women really only had two opportunities. You either became a nurse or you became a teacher. So there was a expansion of secondary schooling in the 70s and 80s, and what we have is essentially a huge bulge of teachers who were the first in often their families to complete secondary schools, and they then entered the two professions open to them. So we've got this huge bulge of teachers. There's another story that's interesting. It's not directly related to your question, but that the current cohort of teachers that we have, this older generation, are also the top high school graduates. So the unique feature of South Africa is many of the older generation are often the very top high school students because there were no other opportunities. So we have an advantage of having a very strong, intellectually very strong group of people in the teaching profession, even if the instructional practice is extremely weak.
So I was interested in two things. One is you mentioned that this gains that you see, they're not gonna hit the ball out of the ballpark, right? But still, I think it'd be really interesting to benchmark those gains in terms of what they represent. Maybe with regards to diminishing the gap that exists between poor students and less poor students, or compared to other programs, what is this gain specifically that you see and that you will about to see hopefully in your new analysis of results in the next couple of months. But the other thing, so I don't know if you can say anything about that now, but the other thing that you had discussed is about the crowding out of the home language learning. And so I would be interested in finding out a little more about that and what you were able to learn from the interviews.
So let me start with the second question about the crowding out. What the teachers say is, why don't we have lesson plans in the home language? So what they're saying is the reason why they're teaching English is they've got a method that works. And I think that if and we're currently working in both home language and English lesson plans, so the crowding out might be a function that the teachers now have a methodology that's effective, not so much that they're privileging English versus home language. Again, we don't know that for certain. But on the question of kind of benchmarking, we're very keen to develop a way of assessing comparatively the success of programs. And obviously in the home language, the key would be to look at oral reading fluency. But we've discovered that, it's a kind of such a simple insight, that the benchmarks that we use in English cannot be the same benchmarks in all languages. So we've got two big language clusters, Nguni language and Sesotho languages, and Nguni languages are agglutinate. They essentially have long words, and then children who are fluent readers are often reading 40 or 35 words a minute, whereas in English you have to be at 70 or 75 or the equivalent in order to be a fluent reader. So we're now in the process, and I think the department is at the forefront of this, establishing benchmarks, oral reading fluency benchmarks, which will be a very critical way in which we can then evaluate programs without having to do full RCTs. We'll be able to see, are those children, what proportion of children are meeting the minimum benchmarks? And I think that's, definitely the Department of Basic Education needs to be given credit, particularly the Research Directorate, of recognizing that there are many different pieces that we need to get right and have started to do the work.
Thanks very much to Bram, Kato, and Karine, the people who've stuck around. Let's give them a round of applause.